Welcome to another episode of Overcome Out Loud with Charlie Smith. This podcast has been created and is really committed to sharing the courageous stories of men and women that have overcome adversity in their lives and are thriving today, to give anybody who's suffering in silence hope. And I've been really excited and been spending a lot of time getting to know our guest today, Kelley Gunter. Kelley, welcome to Overcome Out Loud, and thank you so much for being on.
Hi, I'm excited to be here.
So Kelley, by way of introduction, has a lot of roles, wears a lot of hats. Most importantly, she is on the National Suicide Hotline. She's a published author. She is a Christian public speaker, shares openly about her story of overcoming the trials and challenges in her own life, and a life coach, and uses her experience to help others, and is coming on today. Really, I love when we have people like Kelley on, because Kelley is a survivor like myself. She suffered in silence and is now overcoming out loud to help you. And she also is a subject matter expert. So she's got a lot of skills as a life coach and as a licensed therapist in Ohio, and as somebody who's on the front lines for suicide, who's out there helping people and using her own experience as a way to do that, which I think is a gift. So I'm really excited to learn so much about you, and thanks again for taking time.
Of course, of course. I mean, that's what we're here for. Once we survive the darkness, first we have to figure out why we survived and then what we're going to do about it. And so that's my mission. That's my purpose, to just reach out and let other people know that if I can get out of the darkness, they absolutely can too.
Yeah, it's so important, and our podcast is one of hope, and I think through the power of sharing our stories, we help people have an identity of not being alone, and that no matter how far down the scale they may feel, whether it's with addiction or substance abuse or a medical diagnosis or childhood trauma or sexual abuse, that we all have a story, and there's people that have overcome it, and giving people kind of the ladder steps for themselves to do that is so helpful. And I think origin stories are important, and maybe you could just start with a little bit of your origin story for us, Kelley.
Yeah, of course. I grew up in a middle class family, and I think that is one of the key components that I always like to stress to people is, I'll just say it. When I graduated high school, I graduated fourth in my class. I was a cheerleader. I was captain of the volleyball team on National Honor Society. I could go on and on and on and on and on, prom queen, all these different things. But like, what no one knew is from the ages of 7 to 14, I was being sexually abused and raped on a daily basis in my own home by my older teenage brothers. And that trauma was just the catalyst for a life that was riddled with addiction, self-destruction, and mistakes. And people look at who someone is, they look at what's going on, they just assume everything is okay. And the reason that is because we don't like to think as a society that that type of abuse is happening in the neighborhoods we frequent or the neighborhoods that we live in. And so no one looked at me and thought, oh, there's something going on at home. They had no idea, because we like to think, oh, abuse is happening in the neighborhoods that, we're afraid to drive through. And that's just so erroneous. And one of the teams that I was involved with in high school, after I came out with my story and finally shared the truth of the abuse I suffered, every girl on that team but two reached out to me and said, me too. And so all of us were in high school together, playing a sport together, practicing together, experiencing the same type of trauma, and no one ever said a word.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So for me, as a survivor of violent childhood abuse that started about a little younger than yours, mine started at the age of 6 and was violent. I had a very strong desire to, like most kids, fit in at school, and so I learned this kind of pattern of dishonesty at a very young age, because if I wanted to fit in at school, then I needed kids to think I was like them. And what was happening at my home, I knew they weren't covering up bruises. I knew they weren't holding back tears. I knew that they hadn't suffered whatever I had suffered the night before. And if I wanted to fit in, at 6, 7, 8, and 9, then I sure better act like them and pretend I am like them. And my family was on the cover of Catholic Digest fucking magazine. I mean, we were the model Catholic family, 1970, with a father who had beaten his son to a bloody pulp, with a closed fist at the age of 7 years old. But to your point, we have these coping skills, these survival mechanisms that really don't serve us because we're taught to live in a certain with a certain image, and dysfunctional families. I think you can talk more about it. Is that kind of don't tell, don't share, don't talk. That whatever happens in here is happening in here, and if it gets exposed, that it's going to be a negative reflection on you and on us, and we just fucking don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And, I love that you speak on one of the things I'm doing. I'm pursuing my doctoral degree in traumatology and counseling. And what people don't understand is that those survival skills that we develop as children become so fixed in our lives and in the patterns of our brain. They're very well traveled pathways. And those behaviors continue even when the trauma ends. And those are behaviors and those are pathways in our brains that can absolutely be reconfigured, but we can't change what we don't acknowledge. We can't heal what we don't acknowledge. And each one of us walks a different path. We each go through a different journey. We can't compare trauma. We can't say, oh, well, I was sexually abused and I never did what she did. Because I think the important thing for everyone to remember is you may have suffered a similar trauma to somebody, but you didn't suffer it in their body, with their DNA, in their environment, with their parents and their surroundings. So that's why we can't compare trauma. And so those survival skills just become incredibly unhealthy coping mechanisms as adults. And just like you, I did a great job of putting on a happy facade of saying, this is who I am, and always being able to perform for people. And because I knew that no one, I thought, no one will ever love you if they know the truth. That's what I thought.
Yeah, it's very common, and it's haunting is the only way. It's exhausting and haunting to go around feeling like I need to be someone different than I actually am, and I need to portray and exist in this double life. And that's where I think, when our beliefs and our behaviors are out of alignment, when we really aren't who we say we are on the outside, I think that's where this integrity gap gets created, and that's where the numbing comes in. And maybe, I think it's a great place to talk a little bit about the coping skills. So, cheerleader, volleyball team, popular, sexual abuse, tortured, abused, and really being traumatized. You've got to fill that gap somewhere, because I'm not who I'm showing you I am on the inside if I were to open up and you were to see the pain. And I've got to cover that discrepancy up somehow. And I think you talked a little bit about where some of maybe the substance abuse or the other kinds of unhealthy behaviors kind of fill that integrity gap and allow us to kind of just breathe. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with that integrity gap and how you kind of filled that void?
Yes. And for me, initially, the first thing I did was I used food as comfort.
Yeah.
So, I got a bachelor's degree in sociology, a master's degree in clinical counseling. Of course, I was going to try to heal everybody else. I couldn't heal me, but I was going to work on everybody else. And it's that classic myth of the wounded healer. They can't heal themselves, but they can heal everybody else. And so, but by the time I finished grad school, I weighed almost 300 pounds. And within a few years, I was up to almost 400. So I weighed 391 pounds. And that was weight that I carried for almost 20 years. So that led to a different level of trauma, because the world is very cruel to people who don't fit into what society thinks is an acceptable size, an acceptable body. And, my book that you talked about earlier, the title of my book is You Have Such a Pretty Face. And that was because so many people said to me on a regular basis, oh, it's just a shame about your weight. You have such a pretty face, and that's not a compliment. It's the unsaid part is too bad about your body. And anybody who's ever had a weight issue has heard that from somebody. And people who have read my book, I was, very surprised. My book hit #1 on Amazon last year, and it's self-published. So for that to happen was like a really big, deal to happen for a self-published author. But my book is about so much more than my weight loss journey. Eventually in 2002, I decided to have weight loss surgery. And so in 14 months, I lost 243 pounds. And I've maintained that now. This is 20 years. But my book, I didn't write my book when it happened. I wrote my book after all the addictions, like that we'll get into, eventually caused me to lose everything. And so while it does talk about my weight loss, the subtitle of my book is a memoir of trauma, hope, and the joy that follows survival, because food was my Band-Aid. When I couldn't overeat anymore, once I had weight loss surgery, I ripped that Band-Aid off. So food was my Band-Aid. I needed to talk about the wound. Instead of talking about the wound, I just got other Band-Aids. And I went from addiction to addiction to addiction. And that's one thing that's very dangerous with weight loss surgery is cross addictions. The percentage of people who have cross addictions following weight loss surgery is very significant, because there's a reason people have ended up morbidly obese. There's a reason they used food as comfort. And if they don't deal with that reason, then either they're going to develop cross addictions because they won't be able to eat the way they once did following weight loss surgery, or they lose all their weight, then immediately they start to gain it all back, and which is equally painful and just so depressing for people. And so for me, I had all kinds of process addictions. I had a pain med addiction. I had a shopping addiction, a gambling addiction. You know, people think shopping addiction isn't real. It's very, very real. When I speak in person at places, I show pictures of Christmas at my house with my son. I've always been a single mom. I've never been married. So this was me and a little 6-year-old little boy. Like, all the presents under the tree were for him. And when people see those pictures, like, audiences just gasp. And he would get so tired of opening, he'd say, can I stop? And, you know, I would cart all the presents downstairs. He'd be opening up presents for the rest of the year. And then I'd work, you know, I'd charge up the credit cards doing that, then work all year to pay them off, and then do the same thing. You know, shopping gave me some of that worth that I didn't have. I thought, oh, if I can buy my son all the best of the best, if I can get him everything he wants, you know, if I buy myself the right shoes, the right purse, the right clothes, then I have worth. And you can't buy your worth. So, you know, it was just a constant, you know, trying to achieve something that I could not achieve with what I was doing, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. I mean, you know, the message here, the lesson here is for all of you, is that what you don't deal with will deal with you. So if you are in pain, if you are sad, if you are hurting, if you're being abused, if you're being bullied, you know, if you are being ostracized because of your race, sex, gender, and you're not dealing with it with somebody, that it will ultimately deal with you. And the way it deals with us is typically in unhealthy, numbing ways, whether you just went through a litany of them that you experienced. And so, you know, I think it's a great message point for us to emphasize that, you know, asking for help is a sign of courage, and that you don't have to suffer in silence anymore, as you were just depicting, because what you don't deal with will ultimately deal with you. And that integrity gap, that kind of numbing, you know, it has no end. It's just going to continue until you deal with it. And so maybe it's a good point to really talk about, you know, the most important part of self. I mean, a lot of people talk about self-confidence, they talk about self-esteem, but for me, the most important thing I ever learned was self-acceptance. You know, to really learn to accept Charlie Smith for who Charlie Smith was, to get to know him at his core, not how other people defined him, but how he wanted to be defined by himself. And that's where I think you can start to close that gap. How did that happen for you, Kelley? And do you relate to that at all?
I do relate to that very much. And for me, ultimately, you know, there was a constant push for success, for, you know, how can I get this going? And oh, we have a visitor. Hello.
Hello. Welcome. How are you, buddy? Back from
Mr. Back.
back from the vet.
Yes, he opens doors. He's very smart. So the doors were closed, but he can open them. So sorry for that.
Not at all. But can just, I mean, no coincidence. I mean, he's an important part of your healing journey. I mean, huge. And people need to understand that we can find support and connection in so many ways, and you know, our pets and our animals and the relationships we have as caregivers, you know, from somebody who is somewhat dependent on us but not codependent on us, because they just love you unconditionally. It's been really important for you, hasn't it?
Incredibly important.
Yeah.
Because what ultimately happened, to speak to that, like in the sort of the right context, I ended up, like, I started a business. The business became very successful relatively quickly. I was the CEO of that business for 13 years. And then I started gambling. And so I misused money from that business and gambling. And the thing is, the trauma I had experienced had so affected my judgment and my consequential thinking that I literally didn't even realize anything I was doing could possibly be like something that could come back to really be devastating in my life. And so eventually I was charged with theft. I lost everything. I lost my home, the business, our cars, every person I loved, person I was involved with. It was my son and I and one friend who stood by me. And it was then that I decided to go into treatment. And so at that point, even someone from my business had said, you know, Kelley, I don't know what's going on with you, but whatever it is, I went to treatment in Sedona, and they said, when you get there, just tell them everything. And I was sitting on the plane waiting to go to Sedona, and I just remember thinking, I'll tell them everything. Like, I have no problem saying everything that's gone on. But I was like, I'm not going to discuss the sexual abuse. Like, even at that point, there was nothing left to lose. I had lost everything, and I was not going to discuss the sexual abuse. And it took them days to even get me to speak about it. And they told me, they said, we knew that we had our hands full when you walked in the door. You were a therapist. You knew what we were looking for. You knew how to divert us from that. You knew how to, not do that. And it was such, that shame had such a bind on me at that point that I literally couldn't speak it. And when I finally did, that was when my true healing journey began. And that was 6 years ago. I've been sober since then with all of it. And as for my dogs, at the time I had 3 Rottweilers. Now I have 1 because, they don't outlive us usually. But it was like a portal had been opened. And I was having night terrors and flashbacks constantly. And it was just trauma that had been so pushed down for so long that I had to work through it. I had to process through it. And that's what I always try to speak to people is a lot of people have this idea that healing is like sitting around a campfire singing Kumbaya. And that's not healing at all. Healing is painful. And people who choose to heal their wounds are warriors. They're just the people who have said, I refuse to let this kill me. And it's so much more difficult. On a daily basis, I had to put into play, I had to stop and ask myself, how do I want to deal with this? How do I want to deal with these feelings? Because there's so much more to it than just, mechanisms to deal with flashbacks, mechanisms to deal with night terrors, which are different than nightmares. It's a flashback in your sleep, and which processes in a different part of your brain. So you wake up and you feel as if the trauma just happened 5 minutes ago, and in your brain it did. So that's a different thing than having a nightmare and being like, oh, that was a bad dream. No, you wake up feeling like I was just raped. And so those are different things that you have to work through. But then also the even more or equally as difficult was learning the skills to not manipulate because I learned to manipulate throughout my entire life, like you said, to lie about things, as a protection for myself. I would go to school and say I was sick, because if I was sick, the nurse would call my mom. She would come and get me and take me to work with her. If I did that, then I could escape being raped by my brothers after school that day. So, you learn those behaviors that don't just leave you. So learning to allow myself to be vulnerable with people, to be able to say, okay, if I speak my truth to this person, and it could be something minimal, like, no, I don't want to have lunch. But I couldn't do that. I would come up with a million different reasons why I couldn't, because I had never learned that it's just okay to say no. I grew up in a home where the people who loved you hurt you. How many rape victims have to have dinner at night with the person who raped them in the morning? And that was my reality. The people who loved me, the people I handed Christmas presents to, hurt me. So my idea of love was very skewed, very complexly inaccurate, and replacing all of those things and learning I can respond to this person. I can even say, I'm upset about this, whatever it is with a friend. Like, I can speak the truth. And like, if the worst thing that happened is they don't want to be my friend anymore, I can survive that. And like literally a million different decisions a day. How do I want to respond to this? Do I want to change and be a healthy person? Because it was very easy to be like, no, I'm just going to lie. Do you know what I mean? But I wanted so much to be healthy. I wanted to be that person who had appropriate boundaries was okay with having them. But that doesn't just change like that. That's something that in 100 different ways on 100 different days, I would stop and be like, how do I want to handle this? And then I would respond. And that takes a lot of resiliency and strength when it's terrifying. And that's why I say, bring me the battered, bring me the broken, bring me the people with the scars. Those are the people I want on my team, because those are the people who know how to fight. Those are the people who their legs may be shaking, their voice might be weak, but they stand up again on this day and say, I'm going to live. And those are the people that I like. Your brokenness is welcome here. We'll get through it. And because I promise anybody out there, if you look around in the darkness, you'll see my footprints. I went through a time of wanting to end my own life. I tried to hire someone to kill me. That's how significant my pain was. I just didn't think I had worth. I didn't think I could live. I didn't think there was a way to recover from all of the devastation that ultimately I brought on myself. Because the thing is, the mistakes I made in the blur of addiction were my fault. And taking responsibility for those mistakes, but saying my trauma wasn't my fault, were two paths that had to come together for me to be able to walk peacefully and in a happy place. And so my trauma wasn't my fault, but the mess that was left was my responsibility to clean up. And that's a really difficult thing to be able to make peace with. But if we want to survive it, that's what we ultimately have to do.
Wow. I mean, there's so much to.
There's a lot there.
No, it's incredible. I think there's you're just a gift. I mean, just literally a gift to the world, and I'm glad we have you. The first thing that I caught was when you went to treatment, and I think the two basic human needs, from a emotional standpoint, not food and water, is belonging and connection. And that narrative of, if you know me, you won't love me, is so strong that it suppresses that ability to share your full truth. I mean, the sexual abuse that was occurring was something that you viewed would shatter your ability to belong and to connect to people authentically, and so you protected it with everything, every fiber of your being, as you got into treatment. And I think there's the first part is to give people the assurance that it's just not true. That if people truly get to know you, the real you, and see you for who you are, that your belonging and connection will grow. It's what's actually separating you from your fellows.
Right. And we have a responsibility to heal. The other powerful thing, I think, too, is for people to understand it is so powerful. That shame is so powerful. And to think that it isn't, to minimize it and be like, well, it can't be that bad. It controls every single thing you do. I pushed it down and I thought, I said to myself, the way I dealt with it being a therapist myself was, I was like, okay, I have this box on the shelf. I know I was a victim, but it's not controlling me. I'm just putting it over there and the world doesn't have to know. And honestly, the world doesn't have to know. I needed to acknowledge it to heal. Not everybody's journey is to get up and speak from Maine to Spain. That's just what I've chosen to do. But our brain, when we speak what we think we can't speak, it actually causes a physical process in our brain that allows our brain to switch from being hypervigilant into rest and repair. And even if we speak it, like the same thing is journaling. If we journal about our feelings about it, I tell my life coaching people all the time, journal about what you're feeling, journal it. And one person said, well, I'm afraid my husband will read it. As soon as you journal it, burn it. Like, it doesn't have to be, but like, you getting it out allows that process to occur. Whether you speak it out loud or whether you journal it, the same process occurs in our brain. And that's the beginning of when we can start to let our brain get into rest and repair and heal. But so many people are walking around and they have no idea. That's why I say people love to point fingers. They love to say, oh, she sleeps around. He does coke before work. This. He cheats on his wife, all these different things. But nobody thinks about why. Because the truth of it is that when there's any type of childhood abuse, whether it's sexual, physical, neglect, whatever it is, our brains are developing. And our brains develop differently because of that trauma. And if you take an MRI scan of my brain and an MRI scan of someone's brain right now as adults who did not experience any of that trauma, they're very different. And the physical difference is in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And I'm not trying to do some big physical thing here, but it's real. And so when people just tell you, let it go, there is a point when you do have to make a decision to say, I'm letting this go, but not before you process it. You have to be able to work through it, process the things that have happened to the degree that you are through enough of it that you can say, now it's time for me to live in my future. If not, like that trauma and that pain will keep us shackled to the past. And for me, at this point in my life, I'm only looking back to see how far I've come. I don't have to relive trauma. I don't have to relive everything that's been done to me. Does trauma resurface? Of course. Anybody who tells you that it won't, that you won't have triggers, that things won't come up, that's a lie. But you can develop your methods of dealing with it, that it doesn't put you in bed for 4 days, that you learn to be like, okay, like this is what's going on, process it, and keep moving forward. You don't have to live there anymore.
I think you've debunked a bunch of myths here. You've debunked a bunch of myths here, which are important. The first being that, which I think I felt at a point in my life, and I know it sounds like you felt as well, that if I let this beast out, that there'll be no end to it. That it's going to consume me. I don't want to deal. If I can leave it on the shelf, I know where it is, and I'll deal with it. Enter drugs, enter sexually acting out, enter shopping, enter all, like I said, what you don't deal with will deal with you. Because the thought that I can actually open that box and not have it just swallow me up is insurmountable. And I love the fact that you've talked about this kind of gradual process, because I am a firm believer that champions are born and then unmade. We get this narrative where the pen to the story of our lives gets stolen out of our young hands and other people start to write. In fact, I've got a gift for you I'll share a little later as we talk, because I've started a platform called My Life, My Pen, where I've actually decided in 2008 for me was when I took the pen back and decided that I would write on the pages of my life. And you've been doing that for some time now, and it won't consume you. It actually is freeing. Did you share that overwhelming feeling? If I open this box just a little, I'm not going to be able to control what comes out and how long it's going to last, and I'd just soon leave it on the fucking shelf.
Yeah. And like I talk in my book about Pandora's box.
Ah.
And people always say, oh, I don't want to open Pandora's box. But I talk in my book that the last thing that came out of Pandora's box was what? Hope. Zeus had put all the evils of the world into Pandora's box. And when Pandora opened it, all of it was let out into the world. And, ultimately her husband, they heard something crying in the box, and they're like, well, we might as well open it. She had all these wounds from all the insects biting and stinging her. And they open it, and cowered in the corner was hope. And so when people say you're going to open Pandora's box, well, what was the last thing that came out of Pandora's box? Hope. And, I say in my book that I believe that hope stands for hold on, pain ends. And, that's just in the darkest, darkest times. In fact, at one point when I was at my darkest, I was on YouTube. I was just looking for a video that I could find hope in, that I could be like, okay, somebody made it through, and something to give me hope. And so I found this speaker, and she had said, like I've sat in those very seats and not known if I'd live through the night. And I thought, okay, this is the one. I have to listen. I got my tablet, like I'm all ready, And so as it keeps going, like we get to the end, and I see the like little bar on YouTube, and I'm like, there's only like 3 minutes left. Like what else could happen? And I'm like, for a second, I said to myself, and this was completely wrong, so let me preface this with that. I said, oh my God, that's all she went through? Like, I was like, if I had to go through that, I'm just going to call that a walk in the park, you know? And immediately, like, I always feel like my karma has been pretty instant. It's like as if God slapped me in the back of the head himself. And like, we can't compare trauma. You know, what was that painful for her may not be that painful for me. But what's super painful for me might not hurt somebody else. Because of that, we all have different DNA, we have different coping, we have different levels of resiliency. And we can't compare trauma. But it was in that moment that I told God, if you will get me through this, I will speak. Because I could find all kinds of stories of people who had been through hellacious things and survived and overcame and were able to, you know, receive so many blessings. But I was having a hard time finding people who'd been through a lot of hellacious things and had made mistakes and made it through. You know, like, I looked at people, I'm like, well, of course she got blessings. She didn't make any mistakes. Somebody traumatized her. She was a victim and she never did anything wrong. So, of course, you know, life, God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, allowed her to bounce back. But I'm like, what about those of us who did make mistakes, who didn't even realize, you know, what they were doing at the time because they were so blurred by their addictions and their unhealed trauma? What about those people? And I realized, like, at that moment, that what gives most people hope is scars, is someone that they can look at on. I needed to see someone who messed up more than me, or who had been through more than me and had came out the other side and was okay. And I realized I've been through a lot. You know, when I had the weight loss surgery, I died having the surgery. They told my parents I wouldn't live through the night. They said, make her funeral plans. She's not going to survive this. And that's a huge story of the presence of God and how closed doors changed my life. But 20 years later, I'm still here. You know, I mean, there's so many different things, so many places that God has shown up in my life. And I just realized I don't want to hear an expert on the stage. I don't care how many credentials are behind their name. I want to hear somebody who's been through something that gives me hope that I can make it through too. So on that day, I got on my knees and I just told God, if you will give me the strength to get through this, I will speak. And that is where my desire to start speaking originated, like in the pit of despair. It was not a good place.
Yeah, but sometimes it's out of that very spot where, you know, that one little kernel, that one little seed, that one ray of sunlight is all we need to plant a seed that ultimately grows into the incredible woman you are today, and speaking and writing and sharing from the mountaintop of your own life today. Because, you know, like you, I think people need to hear from the broken that have healed. That's why, you know, Overcome Out Loud exists, is because there are too many people suffering in silence, because they have that warm blanket of guilt and shame that, you know, yeah, but she didn't do this or he didn't do that. Well, I did do that. I did drive with my kids in my car while I was loaded. I did, you know, act out inappropriately. I was unfaithful to I did act outside of the values and the principles that I always wanted to live by. And you talk so powerfully about these two roads, the road of trauma and the road of personal responsibility, coming together and saying, yes, this happened to me when I was young, and yes, I did this, and I got to own this,
Yes.
and I got to let the other person own this. And when those two paths come together, I've never heard it spoken so clearly as today. When those two roads come together and you can take responsibility and own your mistakes and decide to right your wrongs, and let the other person deal with their wrongs, and not take on, you know, their blame, the healing really does begin.
Yeah. And I think for anybody who's struggled with addiction, so many people have had types of mistakes. And one of the things that I did a webinar for In the Rooms. It's a global recovery
Yes,
platform.
yes.
And they had like Super Saturday, Sunday, and Super Saturday Recovery, blah, blah. And I got to be one of the experts on there twice. And I talked about how, you know, when we suffer with an addiction and we make mistakes, we lose people and we feel betrayed. We feel like, how could you do that to me? I thought you were my friend. I thought you would be with me forever. And then recovery tells us, take responsibility for your mistakes. But like, if we don't deal with the grief from losing people, we will push that down and ultimately try to numb that pain with something else. So we have to be able to say, I'm taking responsibility for my mistakes, but I'm also allowed to grieve what I lost. And sometimes those things are in direct opposition of each other, because I had to be able to say, I feel really betrayed by people I was friends with for over 30 years. And I thought, the Bible says a friend loves at all times. That's what I used to say in treatment. And I'm like, but they didn't love me. Like at my worst, they left me. And I had a right to work through those feelings of betrayal and loss and the stages of grief. But at the other side of it, I had to be able to say they had every right to leave me, because no one has to live through the crossfire of your addiction. And bringing those two beliefs together, processing the grief, working through that, and acknowledging it at the same time, recognizing everybody's right to leave your addiction. And but both of those were required for me to get to a healthy place. And so many people think, well, I'm not allowed to be upset that people betrayed me, that I felt betrayed, because whether it was betrayal or whether it was them keeping themselves distant from my addiction, it felt like betrayal for me. And I had to be able to work through those feelings to be able to become healthy. And whether I was betrayed or I wasn't betrayed was irrelevant. I felt betrayed. And so I had to work through that, or I would have pushed it down. And ultimately, it would have resurfaced as anger or whatever. But working through those very real emotions, I wrote a blog titled The Cemetery of My Soul, and how the hardest funerals to attend were for the people who were still living. But I'd lost them, and those relationships were dead to me. And so I had to go to each gravesite that didn't have a body, only memories of the mistakes that were made, but of also the love that was shared. And I had to be able to pack them up, wish them well in my heart and my soul, and never visit again. Like I had to process that. And that was a very real thing. And I think so many times people think everything was my fault. I'm not allowed to have these feelings. And learning to navigate both sides of that street is really hard. And I think there's a lot of therapists out there who don't try to recognize the necessity to walk down both sides of that sidewalk.
Yeah, you've brought a lot of those kind of conflict resolution strategies to us today, which I mean, you have a really unique way of bringing both sides of the street together for healing. And I think one of the things that is really important is what you talked about, triggers. Knowing that we've got these imprints deep in our subconscious mind about our trauma, that to think that we won't be triggered, whether it's getting into a new relationship or whether it's seeing something on TV for set, whatever it is, there's that we can't predict the things that will trigger our subconscious, which is why the consistency of remaining in recovery. And I don't just mean recovery from substance abuse, but recovery from our trauma, journaling, gratitude, prayer, meditation, using these, you've talked about a lot of these tools, and using them consistently so that when those triggers come, and they do come, that you've got a toolbox to open, and that you don't feel consumed by them, or like you said, that they're gonna knock you off of your center for too long. I mean, you're gonna wobble, and of course you're gonna wobble, but there's lots of tools, and you describe, so how important has that consistency of exercising and using those tools regularly been in facing those unforeseen triggers for you, Kelley?
It's everything for me. And recognizing, like you said, my dogs were such an instrumental. I would have night terrors and wake up, and all three Rottweilers would be beside me with their heads over my stomach. Like I wouldn't even known it. So obviously in the middle of the night, I don't know if I was screaming, what I was doing, but their emotional support for me, even though they were never trained as emotional support animals, they just knew. And that love and that unconditional, like, we wish someone would come through that door. You know what I mean? That gave me a feeling of safety. But being able to recognize, one of my biggest things that will let my triggers just get way out of bounds is if I'm tired. And so I have to rest is so essential for me. When I don't have the right amount of rest, if I don't get the sleep that I need, especially with working on the suicide hotline, I work nights. And so a lot of times during the day, I would just be like, well, I have to speak here. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. and what would suffer would be my sleep. And maybe I would only get 3 hours a day or something. For me, that not getting the rest just it made it impossible to deal with my triggers. And, I can share an example of that. I'd probably gone 2 or 3 weeks with just 3 hours of sleep a night. And for me, that just didn't work well for me. And my son's father was visiting him and had stopped by. And, my son is in his 20s. So they set all that up on their own. Like, we're great friends, but I didn't even know it was midnight, which wasn't strange for the whole house to be up because I work nights. So I was letting the dog out. I knew he was here visiting him, that he had stopped by and they were outside doing stuff. And, but I wasn't even thinking about where they were. And he stood up like in the driveway. He's a big, tall guy, 6'8". I didn't realize he was right there. Well, it scared me. It really scared me. And so like I screamed and I'm like, oh my God, you scared me, Then like it started with the literally like, you stupid, blah, blah, blah. Like, I was just calling him every name in the book. I'm like, who does that? Who stands in somebody's driveway at midnight, just stands up and they don't know they're there, and blah, blah, blah. I just like totally went off and walked in the house, and I stood in my kitchen and I was like, what just happened? Like, why are you so mad? Like, most people would get scared and then could just laugh it off and be like, oh my God, you scared me, and laugh. But like, you literally just like gave your profound use of every expletive in the world. And, like probably every neighbor heard it because it was at top volume. And I'm like, what just happened? And I realized that fear had immediately triggered those feelings of being attacked as a child and not seeing it coming. And typically that wouldn't have been something for me. Typically, if somebody scared me, I'm the same way. I would just laugh and be like, oh my God, you scared me. But I was so exhausted and so tired, I didn't have any coping skills left. And so it triggered it in such a core way that, they both came inside. They're like, like they had not seen me react like that in years. And they just were like, you okay? And I said, I'm sorry. I said, I'm really sorry. Like, I was really sitting in here processing that, thinking, what just happened? Why did I respond that way? And I just realized like what I'm feeling right now is how I felt as a little girl. And I'm sorry. Like, and I realized like I think I took maybe 10 days off of work, not because I was like, oh, now I have to deal with, I just needed to rest. I needed to be I cleared my schedule for several days and just really got the rest I needed, and changed my work schedule because I was like, I can't keep going at this rate. Not getting my rest was really, really difficult for me. And so I think when we see ourselves responding in ways that aren't healthy, being able to stop. Like I said, I walked right in the kitchen and I was like, what just happened? Like, and really thinking about it, you don't have to relive. I didn't go back and reprocess, all these times. Like, I just knew I'm exhausted, and, and this is what's causing that. And I think part of that too, when you said, how do you go through it, is recognizing there will always be things like that then I have to be aware of, that I have to set boundaries when people are like, can you come and speak here? And then we need you to do this, this, and this. And I can only do what I can do. And because rest is paramount for me.
Yeah, it's, when we get on planes, the flight attendants will always tell us to put the oxygen mask on us first and then others. And I think we have to know what oxygen we need, whether it's rest or meditation or some reflective time, or connection with friends. Maybe we have been isolated and we need, it's that kind of hungry, angry, lonely, tired. I mean, which of those oxygens do I need to fill up my soul so that I'm prepared for life on life's terms?
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
Yeah. And for me, it's rest and God. I have
Yeah.
to have those two things first. I have to be able to have time set aside to really spend time with God and listen. I think we're really good at giving him our to-do list. Like, God, this is what I would like you to do. Here's my list. But what I have found is really listening is where I get the most out of my time with God, that he speaks to every one of us in a different way. But for me, reading the Bible, and then like I get just so much back. And every difficult situation I face in my life, the answer has always been given to me. Doesn't mean it took it away, but like how I needed to proceed and the attitude I needed to proceed forward with was given to me.
Yeah, I reframed my relationship with God or my higher power, or whatever you call it.
Right.
Out of the Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, he says, in order to have a friend, you need to be a friend. And I realized that I hadn't been much of a friend to the God I believed in. I asked him for a lot, and took a lot, but I didn't spend a lot of time with him. Never thanked him for the things and the gifts that he did give me, and for sure never asked, God what he needed from me and how I could best be of service to him. Like you said, that conscious listening of what direction, what path I need to go down. And so thank you for sharing the importance of that. And as we wrap up, I have two questions. First, when people are starting to identify that they haven't been dealing with life's certain traumas and suffering, and they're inspired by this conversation to start, what's the kind of that bedrock of foundation that you would give people as the starting point, the safe starting point to start to open that box, Kelley?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're all aware of what we've been through, whether we acknowledge it, whether we speak to anyone about it is a different story. And, as far as sexual abuse goes, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 6 boys in the United States. And that translates into like 82 million adult survivors of sexual abuse in the United States alone. And the National Association of Child Abuse Survivors says that only 95%, okay, I know that's like an oxymoron. 95% of people have never spoken of their abuse to anybody.
Mm.
And only 5% have. And so that if you take those numbers and translate that's 74 million adults walking around who have never uttered a word to anybody about their abuse. And since we know you can't heal what you don't acknowledge, like I just say to people, do something, whether it's pick up this book, like my book. It's so filled with hope. I mean, so many people are like, oh, I thought it was going to be a journey for how to lose weight, but it wasn't. No, it's not. Yes, my weight loss is detailed in there, but it's about the trauma and how there is joy after trauma. But we have to first become comfortable with saying this happened, and acknowledging it doesn't make it go away. And there's nothing that can make it go away, accepting that the past is the past and it is what it is. I had to grieve the childhood I never had. But the first step in that is acknowledging it. Even if you acknowledge it to a journal. I spoke somewhere and a lady reached out to me and said, afterwards on social media, she reached out to me and said, I've been married to my best friend for 33 years. And she said, I've never told him or anyone else that I was sexually abused. And she said, so there you have it. I was sexually abused. And she said, thank you for speaking your truth, because I would have never mentioned mine if you hadn't. And she said, I may never tell another soul again, but at least it's off my soul. And my point with that is, she didn't say I'm married to a fool and we've slept in different rooms for 20 years. She said, I'm married to my best friend for 33 years. And I've never told him about the abuse I suffered as a child. So here's this person you're laying next to every night and they don't know your truth. And you're carrying that around with you forever. And I always tell people, you don't necessarily know everything that your best friend has been through, because we carry secrets with us that are so powerful. And we have to always be aware of the fact that people have a lot that they don't share. And even if you don't want to share it, maybe you just cannot ever bring yourself to say to your mate or whoever it is, this happened to me. Write it in a journal, then burn it if you have to. Get it off your soul. Like, speak it to a journal, speak it somehow, get it off of your soul. You don't have to leave it, around. People are so terrified someone will find it and read it. Burn it right away. My life coaching clients, I work with people from a Christian perspective. I say, write this down. And then together in one of our sessions, we burn it, because God promises beauty for ashes. And I'm like, release it to him, And so, but whether you're a Christian or you're not, get it off of your soul by writing it. The brain interprets that the same way as speaking it. And once we speak it, we know we can survive it.
Wow.
And that's the first thing that I would tell someone to do if they haven't started anything. Recovery is different for all of us. Some people just, that process might be enough that they're like, okay, I can move forward.
Yeah,
Not everybody has to be in therapy constantly. I tell my therapist all the time, like, you have to outlive me. I think everybody, if I could give something to everybody in the world, it would be like, you must do therapy and with a good therapist. And, because we need to be able to process and do things. So, yeah, that's what I would tell people.
wow, you're a bright light, Kelley, and thank you for sharing so much of your soul with us. And I think it's the exact reason why I do this is because there are so many people suffering in silence. The 74 plus million people you spoke of, who are out there, the 5% who haven't had the courage or are still wearing that warm blanket of shame and guilt that we may be able to free today as a result of what you're doing, because you are the emotional warrior. Can you give people, I mean, we'll post it in the show notes so that everybody can find you, but they're going to be listening, so can you just tell people where they can find you and follow you? Your messages are so inspiring. They've touched me so much. Could you just let everybody know how to find you?
Yeah, like my website is just my name, kelleygunter.com. I'm on Instagram. It's actually my last name first, Gunter Kelley. I'm on Facebook. And actually, we're doing a Day of Hope on May 14th right now, it's slated for Lawrenceville Church of God in Springfield, Ohio. But if we continue selling tickets like we are right now, we may have to move to a bigger venue. But it's not just myself, it's myself and four other speakers who have amazing stories of overcoming. We have Dr. Connie Stapleton coming from Georgia. She's been on 1,000 Pound Sisters, all these different television shows. We have a couple of other authors coming in who just have amazing stories of resiliency and the hope and everything God has done in their life. So it'll be an entire day of those speakers and music. And, we're really excited about it. And then as spring goes into summer, I have my own tour that will be happening. And those dates will be on my website for the Heartbeat Tour, because I say, if your heart's still beating, God's not done with you yet. So, you said earlier about champions, whether they're born or not. And, I've always just sort of had the mindset from a friend of mine told me this one time, you can't be a champion without an opponent. And, so the obstacles I've had to overcome in my life, my trauma, my addictions, all those different things, all the obstacles that were thrown my way was my opponent. And so, I'm just determined to let people know it doesn't matter where you are right now in life, like you can still move forward. And if I can survive that darkness, then I feel that my responsibility is to shine light for people who are trying to find their way out of it as well. And so reach out to me. I respond to every message I get, except the marriage proposals. Like I don't respond to those, and I get a ton of those. Like I get some inappropriate proposals. Other than that, I respond to every message I get. It may take me a few weeks, but I do actually respond, and the messages come from me. So, you know, I just feel like that's the thing. My destiny came calling. It just came cloaked as destruction. And so, I can look at it today and say, had that never happened, I wouldn't be who I am today. And so while I, of course, wouldn't choose the obstacles I went through, I wouldn't change them at this point.
Yeah, they've become your miracle and an opportunity for an amazing comeback and giving so many people hope. Kelley, and we will get you in the mail. I'll get afterwards your address, a pen. It says "My Life, My Pen." You've been the author for so long. We want to make sure you get your pen from me to keep writing such
Yes.
amazing things.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, Kelley.